They say that those words have been recorded to Amazing Grace about 7,000 times. The Library of Congress would report that they have in their collection 3,000 versions of that song. In fact, some people have estimated that this year that song will be performed 10 million times around the world. It is undoubtedly the most popular hymn in the English-speaking world. Chris Tomlin, who sang it in that rendition of it and added a bit to it, as you heard and will, Chris Tomlin will be here in Allen Arena, we believe, next October, as Lipscomb University is the host to the Gospel Music Association and the Dove Awards, which will be broadcast across the nation. But we're not here this morning to talk about the success of the song. I want to talk to you about the message contained in the song. All week you've been thinking about resurrection. You've been thinking about reconciliation. You've been thinking about justice. And the reality is that, as essence, that song talks to us about reconciliation as it brings to us a sense of what God will do by extending His grace into our lives. And so we've been asking some questions. Who will bring you freedom? Where will you place your trust? In whom will you find yourself as a part of a larger story? And of course, once redeemed and once the recipient of grace, the natural response is to think about justice, the extension of that grace to others. It's ironic that this story came from the pen of a man who at one point was actually a slave trader. He grew up as a young man with a family and a sense of faith, but denounced that as he went into the slave trade. He was the captain of a number of ships that would go to Africa, bring slaves to North America. And so he was involved in the most unjust moment in that part of history, and yet God worked through him. And the end of the story, he is a minister in London, and in his church is a man by the name of William Wilberforce. And it was that man, as a member of Parliament, who for 18 years continued to ask Parliament to abolish slavery. And 18 years after he began, with John Newton as his mentor, slavery was then abolished. Well, what's between the bookends of this story? What's between the sea captain over here and the minister over here? Well, it seems to me that between that is the demonstration of God's grace in his life. Last year at this time, I came to you and tried not to be your president, although I love that job. It's the best job in the world. But I tried not to be your president, but really to be your friend, because it seems to me that from that perspective, we as a community need to be asking questions of you. We need to be asking questions of you that go beyond so much of what we do. And the most central of all those questions is the one we talked about last year from Matthew 16, where Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, well into his ministry, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples shared the impression that people had of him. And then he turned with that penetrating moment and said, but who do you say that I am? A lot goes on in a community like this. We have 700 or so faculty and staff who have given their careers to be a part of your journey. We will spend this year in excess of $130 million, I hope as good stewards, to surround you with all that goes on in this college experience. And I hope you feel from us and feel sincerely that we are interested in being a part of your journey. But the reality is all of those things that we can structure have very little to do with ultimately answering that question. Oh, you can do all that we require and take 18 units of Bible and have that academic knowledge and all of that information. You can come to chapel the appointed number of times, and I did note that coming to this chapel today, you get 2 credits as opposed to 1, and I just wondered if we needed to provide that incentive because the president was speaking. But nevertheless, you get 2, and that will count toward that longer list, but that really does not answer the question. We go beyond Bible classes, go beyond chapel, and some of you are so generous with your service, and you can serve without ever coming to grips with the ultimate question. And you'll leave here, I believe, with a sense of character that Lipscomb University is known for, but even that does not answer the question. No, the question is going to have to be answered in a much more personal and a much more intimate way. It's going to have to be answered by you either now or some other time in your life. It will either be answered intentionally or it will be answered unintentionally, but it will be answered. Who do you say that he is? In whose story are you going to be a part? Are you going to accept the grace of God that has been offered and shared in that story? John Newton came to his moment in 1748. He's described as a rather vile man. In fact, he was so vile and so irritating and so unloved that on one of the boats he was on doing the slave trade, he mocked the captain in such a way that they actually put him in chains with the slaves for the duration of the journey. They said that all the normal cuss words were used by him, and then he made up his own. And so when he talks about in that first verse, that something saved a wretch like him, he probably was not exaggerating. He was a wretched man. And so here's the moment where the storm comes up on the seas off of the coast of Ireland. And the storms come up and they have no possibility of humanly saving this ship. He talks about standing on the deck and a few feet away, one of his friends was swept overboard, never to be seen again. He lashed himself to one of the pumps and he said he worked for 11 hours straight trying just to stay on board, trying not to be swept away, trying to save the ship. And then that moment came. Then the moment came when he realized he was not in control. He was not in control, and someone else or something else must be. And so he uttered these words in desperation, if this will not do, then Lord, have mercy on us. That was the beginning of his faith. It was the beginning of his sensing there was something larger than him. It was acknowledging his lack of control. But there was no miracle. There was no magic moment there. In fact, he didn't write these words to Amazing Grace for several decades. But he never forgot the moment. And his faith began to grow. And as I mentioned already, he ended his career. Ended his career as a man of God, a minister of faith. That had a tremendous impact on the world. Today, I don't know what shape you're in. I don't know what state you're in. I hope that many of you are in a moment where you say, hold on, Randy, I am in control. Things are going extraordinarily well. I hope that you have a spirit today that says, life is great, spring break was wonderful, my grades are in great shape, I have a job for this summer, Europe in the fall, my parents are giving me every single thing I want and not asking a thing in return, my relationships are in great shape, and I even found a parking spot when I first looked for it this morning. I hope that all of your life is in control. And for those moments, we'll rejoice. And when I get to Starbucks after this, I'll see you there and rejoice in the fact that you're experiencing one of life's really, really, really good moments. You know, the greatest risk in that moment is to believe that it is in your control. One of the greatest risks when it's going well is to believe that you have everything handled. And so often in that moment, leave out the God who is waiting to extend his grace to you. But today, it seems to me that probably some of you are not in that shape, that you're not in control, that the seas are rough and the waves are tall, and you're struggling to stay in any kind of control, perhaps even to survive. You may be a first-generation student who's come to this university studying in your second or third language, wondering how in the world you're going to get through. You may be one of our veterans coming from Iraq or Afghanistan, and the horrors of war are in your mind every single night, and you replay those scenes that most of us cannot imagine. You may be someone who comes from a broken home and wonder why your parents seemed relatively happy and stayed together for all those years, and when you went away to college, broke the news that they would no longer be married. Some of you in this audience are wrestling with your own addictions, some to alcohol, some to drugs, some to a number of other things, and you can't believe that these have such a hold on you when you're supposed to be in such control. Some of you are in abusive relationships. Some of you are experiencing loss in your own families, like 2 of our students have done this week. And so we come to this moment where we recognize, even though it might supposed to be different, and even though at this age I was hoping it would be different, you come to the moment and recognize that I'm not in control, and God's grace, whatever that is what I'm grasping for. I think I know something about what that's like. Several weeks ago, you were so gracious. Several weeks ago, you were so gracious because in the gathering here, I had my 93-year-old father. He sat right down there where Jim is seated, and I introduced him to you, and you were so gracious to welcome him to this assembly. You don't know much of the story, but you welcomed him and gave him a moment he will take with him for the rest of his life. But you don't know all the story. Dad left when I was 6 years old. I grew up and for many years had no way to contact him, didn't know where he was, not a telephone number, not a city. And I can remember the moments where a dad would have really been nice. Playing Little League and not having anyone in the audience. I can think of the times where that kind of male influence and that kind of mentoring I longed for, and God's grace provided it with some other folks, but not my dad. I remember thinking what it would be like to have someone that I could call, that in those moments that I needed money or I needed help, he would be there, and he wasn't. And so I think I know something about what it's like when all of a sudden we don't control the world we live in and we long for something else. Well, God was gracious to me even in those contexts. Oh, there were men that came into my life and filled some of that void, not all of it, but some of it. There were officers at the Redlands Police Department where I worked for a year who allowed me to see in them what it meant to be a man. There were guys down at the YMCA, and when I went down there, they were there, and there was some camaraderie. And there was Jack and Alan Levine, a father and a son that owned a men's store in my town that allowed me my senior year of high school to work for them, but much more importantly, to see and experience them. See, God does bring, even through other people, a sense of grace. But it's ridiculous for us to think we're always in control and it's always going to be right, because that probably is not the case. Ironically, now I support my dad. Ironically, now I do get to talk to him every day or every 2 or 3 days. Ironically, Ron and I are in the position of taking care of him in years that he's living that he never anticipated even being here. And so it was selfish when I brought him to the gathering and wanted him to remember you. wanted him to remember this institution, and wanted him to have some sense of the faith that you show every day. And so what do we do in the moment? Well, it seems to me that my situation isn't like yours, and yours isn't like me, but we can identify with the words that John Newton wrote all those years ago when he said with a sense of confidence, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures." Oh, the Apostle Paul reminded us of that a little bit earlier. He said that it is for by grace that you have been saved through faith. It is not from yourselves. You're not the ones that do this. It doesn't come from you. You don't have that kind of power any more than John Newton had. It is a gift. It is a gift from God. You may remember the country singer Johnny Cash. He spent a career singing in prisons across the country. He sang for those that had no control of their daily existence. He sang for those who all freedom had been taken from. And he often sang this song, "Amazing Grace." And standing in front of those prisoners and having that experience over and over and over again, he said this, for the 3 minutes that song is going on, everybody is free. It frees the spirit. It frees the person. And so it's no wonder that during the Civil War, people sang Amazing Grace. It's no wonder that during the Civil Rights Movement, 100 or so years later, people sang Amazing Grace. It's no wonder that in the tragedy of 9/11, when we had no control and wonder what was happening, people sang Amazing Grace. It's not a surprise that during Katrina, and people see their lives destroyed, they turn once again and they sing Amazing Grace. They're trying to confirm what God is doing, and God is transforming His world and transforming our lives and helping us understand that in the moments we don't control, His grace will be there. And so Chris Tomlin, in his version of it, added these words. With a sense of victory, he said, "My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, His mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace." And so, not from a president, but from a friend, I ask you these questions. During this resurrection week, as we anticipate the sorrow of Friday but the joy of Sunday, as we recognize that the crucifixion took place but so did the resurrection, as we think about that story, what will your response be? Because in that story, God is offering His grace to you. And you don't have to accept it. One of the wonderful things about faith is that it's completely free, but it's not required. But He'll offer it, and He'll ask you the question, who do you say that I am? How you doing today? In whose story are you in? Do you need to be set free? How can God's grace rescue you? And with those questions on your mind, listen once again to these words.